If you're new to AskReddit cheating drama, make sure to subscribe and like the video. It only takes a few seconds, but it really motivates us to create more crazy cheating stories. Now, let's get into the story. I don't remember the exact moment it began. There wasn't a dramatic kiss, no reckless impulse under the rain, no broken vows echoing through a slammed door. It started in silence. The kind of silence that grows so slowly, so subtly, you don't realize you're drowning in it until you try to speak. And no one hears you. David and I have been married for 10 years. A decade of shared routines, bills, vacations, dinner tables where we used to laugh and now only pass the salt. To the world, we were fine, stable, successful, enviable, even. But behind closed doors, we had become two polite strangers occupying the same house. I wasn't looking for anything, not affection, not adventure, certainly not love. And then Lucas arrived. He was supposed to stay for a few weeks. Just a favor. David's old college friend, crashing in our guest room while he worked on a photography project downtown. I barely remembered his face from our wedding photos. He was all warmth and wit. The kind of man who noticed things, the way the light hit the kitchen counter, the quiet jazz I played while cooking, the tiredness I tried to hide in my smile. He looked at me like I mattered. At first, I thought it was just kindness, a guest being gracious. But then I started waiting for his footsteps in the hallway. I began wearing lipstick again, though I told myself it was just for me. And when he laughed at something I said, really laughed, I felt something inside me crack open. A room I had sealed shut long ago, now flooded with light. This isn't a story I'm proud to tell, but it's the truth. And sometimes the truth is soft and dangerous and slow burning, like a match held too long. There was a time David looked at me like that. I remember our first apartment, a shoebox with peeling wallpaper and a leaky faucet that sang through the night. We didn't have much, but we had each other. He used to bring me coffee in bed, sometimes with a single daisy he'd picked from the park. He'd press kisses to my forehead like he was sealing a promise. Back then, we didn't talk about forever. We lived it. We used to dance in the kitchen, barefoot, spinning to nothing but our own laughter. I think love disappears in quiet ways, not in betrayal or rage, but in missed calls, forgotten anniversaries, the way two bodies roll to opposite sides of the bed without noticing. It's not always a fall. Sometimes it's a slow fade. David changed, or maybe we both did. His work became everything. Early flights, late meetings, his phone a permanent extension of his hand. He was building something, he said, for us. I wanted to believe that, so I stopped asking for more. I smiled through the loneliness. I told myself this was adulthood. Compromise, patience, endurance. But there were nights I would lie awake next to him, staring at the ceiling, aching for someone to ask me how my day was. Not out of duty, but because they genuinely wanted to know. And it was in that space, the aching quiet between us, that I became someone I didn't recognize. Not unfaithful, not yet. Just empty. I think that's why when Lucas showed up with his crooked smile and paint-stained fingertips, I didn't see danger. I saw a door. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon with the kind of ease only artists seem to carry. Duffel bag slung over one shoulder, camera case in hand, and sunlight chasing his steps like an old friend. "Emily," he said, as if my name was something he genuinely liked the sound of. It's been too long. He smelled like rain and cedarwood, a little disheveled from travel, and entirely comfortable in our home from the moment he stepped through the door. David clapped him on the back like brothers do, already opening a bottle of scotch and pulling out stories from their college days. I smiled, nodded, laughed in the right places. I was good at that, being present without ever truly being seen. But Lucas, Lucas saw. The first night, we all had dinner together. I remember the way he noticed the rosemary I'd added to the roast chicken. Not just noticed, but closed his eyes as he tasted it. "You cook like you're telling a story," he said. David chuckled, distracted. I flushed, then quickly looked away. He stayed in the guest room at the end of the hall. His presence was gentle, like a song playing in another room. Not loud enough to disturb, but impossible to ignore. In the mornings, I'd find him on the patio, barefoot with his camera, chasing the light between branches. We'd sip coffee in silence, sometimes talking about nothing. Favorite authors, songs that made us cry, the strange little details of the world that most people never stop long enough to notice. He listened, not with polite patience, but with real attention. Like everything I said mattered, and it scared me because it had been years since I felt like I mattered. David was always working. Early meetings, urgent emails, business trips. I didn't blame him. I knew he was tired. I knew life was demanding. But part of me had stopped trying to reach him, like knocking on a door that no longer opened. With Lucas, there was no door. There was just warmth. And I began to wonder if it was possible to feel alive again. Not wildly, recklessly alive, but quietly, like coming up for air after holding your breath for too long. It wasn't sudden. There was no thunderclap, no stolen kiss under moonlight. It was slower than that, like the way twilight softens the edges of the day. So gradual, you don't realize it's become night until the stars are already out by. It began with conversations. On the evenings David worked late, which was most of them, Lucas and I would talk. At first, in the kitchen while I cooked. Then on the patio, wine in hand, legs tucked beneath us on the old wicker sofa. The kind of conversations that wander, that stay with you. He told me about the places he'd been, Morocco, Iceland, Tokyo, but also about the silence after his mother died, the heartbreak that made him stop photographing people for 2 years, the way he always looked for stories in shadows. And I told him things I hadn't said out loud in years. About how I used to sketch furniture ideas in the margins of my high school notebooks. About how I sometimes cried in the shower just to hear my own sobs bounce off the tile. About how I missed being touched, not sexually, just tenderly. Lucas never interrupted. He never looked away. One night, I laughed at something he said, something stupid and small. And he just looked at me. Not the way David looked at me now, distracted, absent. Lucas looked like I'd said the most beautiful thing he'd heard all day. That night, after I went to bed, I lay awake in the dark and whispered his name into the pillow. I hated myself for it. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just lonely, that Lucas was only kind because he was a guest, and I was being foolish, a bored housewife spinning daydreams out of crumbs. But the next day, I wore the blue blouse David once said brought out my eyes. And when Lucas actually noticed, and smiled, I felt something bloom in me, something soft and dangerous. From then on, everything felt loaded. The way our hands brushed when we reached for the same coffee mug. The way his laugh lingered longer when I made a joke. The way my heart raced when I heard his footsteps in the hallway, even before I saw him. There was no line crossed, but I was already standing on the edge, toes curled over the border of something I wasn't sure I could come back from. It happened on a rainy Tuesday. David was out of town for a conference. Lucas and I had the house to ourselves, not by design, just circumstance. The kind of coincidence that, looking back, never truly feels like coincidence at all. The rain had been falling steadily since morning, a soft, endless hush against the windows, the kind of weather that wraps around you like a secret. We had dinner, pasta, and red wine, nothing fancy. I lit candles without thinking, though now I wonder if I knew exactly what I was doing. We talked, of course, laughed, and then we fell into a quiet that didn't feel awkward, just heavy, electric. We sat on the floor of the living room, backs against the couch, watching the shadows from the candlelight flicker on the walls. He turned to me, slowly, carefully, like a man walking barefoot across glass. "Emily," he said, and the way he said my name made my throat tighten. "You don't have to say anything. I need you to know that being around you feels like breathing." I should have stopped him. I should have laughed it off, stood up, opened a window, changed the subject, anything. But I didn't. I just looked at him. My heart pounded so loudly I thought he might hear it. And then he reached out, not to kiss me, not to pull me into him. He just touched my hand. It was the gentlest thing. Fingers grazing fingers. Barely anything. But my body reacted like I'd been struck by lightning. I pulled away. Too late. The silence after was deafening. He didn't apologize. He didn't have to. We both knew what that moment was. I went to bed early that night, alone, but I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark with my hand pressed to my chest, like I could hold my heart in place. I hadn't cheated. Not really. But I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. In that one touch, I had said everything I'd never dared to say out loud. And worst of all, a part of me wanted to go further. That part terrified me. The morning after felt strangely still. Lucas was already gone when I came downstairs. Said he had an early shoot in the city. There was a note on the kitchen counter in his handwriting. "Thanks for dinner. The rain makes everything feel softer, doesn't it?" No signature. No mention of what had passed between us. I stared at that single sentence for too long. When David returned that evening, he kissed me on the cheek, asked about my week, barely glanced at my face. I answered him like I always did. Softly, carefully, with just enough warmth to keep the illusion alive. But something inside me had shifted. It was like carrying a glass full to the brim. Every step, every word, felt like it might spill over. I started avoiding Lucas, taking longer routes through the house, staying in my studio more. When we were in the same room, we pretended. God, we pretended so well. Polite smiles, brief eye contact, never lingering too long in each other's orbit. But it was there. In the silence, in the unfinished sentences, in the way I could feel his presence even with my back turned. David didn't notice. Or maybe he did, in the way men notice cracks in walls, but never stop to ask how they got there. One night, we had dinner. The three of us. Just like old times, except everything was different. Lucas made a joke. David laughed. I smiled too brightly. And under the table, my hands shook. Afterwards, while I did the dishes, David scrolled through emails on his phone, and Lucas stood in the doorway, watching me. Not with desire, not with guilt, just ache. That night, in bed beside David, I wept silently. Not because of what had happened, but because I knew what hadn't, and how deeply it still broke something sacred. I wanted to rewind, to forget that flicker of something I had found with Lucas. But more than that, more shamefully than that, I wanted to feel it again. It was intoxicating, this quiet pull towards someone who saw me, who heard the parts of me I didn't know were still speaking. And somewhere in the quiet, I realized the worst had already happened. Not the touch, not the confession, but the shift in my heart, away from my husband and towards someone else. It didn't end with a fight. There was no yelling, no accusations hurled across the room, no broken glasses or slammed doors. It ended as it had begun, in silence. One evening, David came home earlier than usual. I was in the living room, flipping through one of Lucas's photography books, though I hadn't seen him in days. He'd been staying out more, late shoots, overnight trips, always vague. I told myself I was relieved. I told myself it was better this way. David walked in, stood behind me for a long moment, then said, "You've been somewhere else lately?" I froze. He didn't sound angry, just tired. So impossibly tired. I turned to him, trying to smile, to deflect. "Just busy with work, I guess." He looked at me then, really looked, for the first time in what felt like months, years, and asked quietly, "Is it Lucas?" My breath caught. I opened my mouth to lie, but the words wouldn't come. He didn't wait for an answer. He just nodded, like he already knew. Maybe he'd known for a while. Maybe he'd been waiting for me to say something, anything, that could make this easier. But there was nothing left to say. He sat down across from me, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "I don't care if something happened," he said. "What hurts is that you left me long before he ever touched you, and I didn't even notice." That broke me. I wanted to cry, to fall into his arms, to beg for another chance. But how do you fight for something you quietly abandoned? How do you ask someone to hold a version of you they no longer recognize? "I didn't mean to leave," I whispered. "I know," he said, "but you did." That night, we slept in separate rooms. Not out of anger, out of understanding. A week later, Lucas left, without a goodbye. No note this time. Just gone. And just like that, the house felt bigger, emptier, quieter than ever. David and I tried, half-heartedly, therapy sessions that felt like autopsies, conversations that circled around the same old wounds. We were gentle, we were kind, but we were done. Eventually, we signed the papers. No one shouted, no one blamed. It was as if we had both been waiting for permission to let go. And when I walked out of that house for the last time, I didn't feel freedom. I felt grief. Not just for the marriage, but for the woman I used to be. The one who once believed love was enough to last. I live alone now. The apartment is small, quiet, filled with plants I forget to water and books I pretend I'll read. Some nights, I light a candle at dinner just to remind myself that I still exist, that I still deserve softness, even if no one else is watching. David and I haven't spoken in months. There's no bitterness between us, only distance. Like two islands once connected by a bridge that slowly collapsed into the sea. He deserved more. So did I. And somehow, we still lost each other. As for Lucas, he disappeared the way he entered my life. Unannounced, untethered. I don't know where he is now. Part of me hopes he's happy. Another part resents him for seeing me so clearly, then walking away like it cost him nothing. But maybe that's unfair, because in the end, it wasn't about him. It was about me, about how easy it was to disappear inside a life that looked perfect on the outside, about how starved I was for something real, something that made me feel like I mattered, about the choices I made, quiet, small, almost invisible, that led me here. I didn't just betray my husband. I betrayed the woman I promised I'd become. And no one tells you how much that hurts. To look in the mirror and not recognize the reflection. To realize you were both the victim and the cause of your own undoing. People always talk about infidelity as a fire. Hot, reckless, destructive. But mine was a slow leak. A soul quietly slipping out the back door while no one was looking. I don't know if I'll ever love again. I don't know if I deserve to. But I'm learning to sit with the silence now. Not as punishment, but as truth. Because sometimes the worst kind of loneliness is the one you create yourself. And I've lived long enough inside that silence to finally start listening.